Egypt, a nation drowning in debt and one that, without the largesse of Gulf nations, would have probably been bankrupted by now. And so Egypt's finally faced up to its economic problems by eliminating subsidies. And as a result, fuel prices rose as much as 78%. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah El-Sisi, though, said the steps were long overdue.
We will need 2 years of hard work and difficult decisions to confront the poverty that has been pressuring us for years. The dangers to the economy are great, so I couldn't delay the decision to partially lift subsidies, even if it cost me my position and support.
But such claims don't seem to wash with the Egyptian people. Ahmed Idris takes us through some of the reaction to the cuts in subsidies.
These are indeed difficult times for Egyptians. They now have to pay more for petrol. The price has gone up by 70%, and that is making a lot of them angry.
This is about the people's livelihoods. This is not going to work. Do they assume that the Egyptian people are just passive and they would just accept anything? They can't go after the rich guys, so they're targeting the poor people.
What can the poor man do in order to survive? What can the government worker who hardly makes any money do? The minister is sitting in comfort behind his desk, but I want you to go onto the streets and see how the people are suffering.
Taxi and truck drivers are also protesting against the increase. Many of them say it will run them out of business.
The customers tell me to complain to the government. But what can I do? I have 4 children to take care of. How can I pay the 60% increase on my own?
But Egypt's Prime Minister has defended the hike, saying it's necessary to help the government balance its budget.
This government is not against the poor people. This government is working to fix things. Go and look at the conditions our hospitals are in.
But the people protesting on the streets say they are angry. And petrol price increase is not the only thing on their mind. Natural gas and electricity tariffs have also gone up. Many say the price increase runs counter to election promises made by former General, now President Abdel Fattah El-Sisi, who had promised to remove the subsidies gradually and that the burden will not be on the poor. Now the people see it differently.
Yeah, they certainly, perhaps understandably, do see it differently. But President El-Sisi says Egyptians need to make sacrifices, and he's taking the lead by only taking half his salary. And really, subsidies are the place to start making cuts. They account for more than 30% of Egypt's budget, which is a lot. In fact, on energy subsidies alone, Egypt spent $96 billion over the last decade. By cutting them, savings could reach around $7 billion, which is about 2.5% of economic output. But remember, we used the phrase drowning in debt earlier. Well, it wasn't without good reason. Egypt's budget deficit stands at 9.5% of GDP. Alarmingly, it could have been 15% of GDP without the $20 billion or so it's received from Gulf states. All told, Egypt's debt situation is a pretty unhealthy 94% of GDP. And then there's the spending we don't know about, namely the military. This is literally a state secret. However, the estimate is that Egypt spends $4.4 billion a year on the military, excluding the $1.2 billion it gets from the United States in military aid. But the military also has its own business empire, if you like, which accounts for between 5 and 40% of the economy. These are businesses which pay no taxes. So the short story is Egypt's got some economic problems. Let's expound on that, shall we, with Angus Blair in Cairo. He's president of the economic think tank, the Signet Institute. Angus, subsidies. This is always an issue in Egypt. We have this cut, which has happened, but we should also be clear that the food subsidies are still in place for now. Is that to assume, then, that there is more pain to come for Egyptians?
No, the food subsidy will remain. It'll be better targeted through cash payments as well as the smart card system. But the government needs better fiscal manoeuvrability, and the fuel subsidy really had to go. It was outrageous because it helped the rich. Mainly 80% of fuel went towards the top 20% of the population. But in terms of food, the food subsidy will stay, but that would be too politically contentious to touch, but it would be better targeted to cut wastage.
That said, can we say that successive governments in Egypt have really failed to get a grip on this whole subsidy issue, and that, that's why it's become such a big deal when the cut's finally made?
Well, historically, most governments in the past, I think, were too afraid of the reaction of the street. And that came about, I think, partially as a result of some reforms that President Sadat tried to do. And then President Mubarak tried to do also, that there were basically rioting, food riots, the last time in about 2008 in Egypt when global food prices were very high. So the end result is that most governments were afraid of the reaction of the street by trying to tackle the fuel subsidies. I think now with population growth at 2.6% per annum, so it's an extra near enough 2 million, just under 2 million extra Egyptians every year, and the fact that the government needed more money from the constitution to spend on health and education, as well as just freeing up some extra cash to use far more productively, really has become a necessity. And the longer it waited, the government was waiting, the far greater the cost. So something had to give, and it was the fuel subsidy.
But when you reduce subsidies, inflation tends to tick up. Would that be the expectation here too?
Yes, there'll be a one-off increase. Some of it will be painful, particularly if it's related to food. But I think the government has already announced that some plans to sell in some shops some key food items more cheaply. But I think this really ought to be seen as a package, and there really should be, I think, a clearer package of what this means for Egypt in terms of the overall economic scheme, because clearly there are monopolies too and oligopolies which control a whole variety of goods. I think that those need to be broken up. I think there needs to be almost an agricultural revolution to increase food production in Egypt and cut wastage. The World Bank estimates around half of all food in Egypt spoiled by the time it reaches the marketplace. If Egypt increased food production, which would be very easy given it has water and it's got heat, and given that if you also cut wastage and improve logistics, then I think that food prices would come down. But inflation is a key issue here. I've talked about it now for over 20 years, and it's a structural issue within Egypt that needs to be addressed. Obviously, it's one of the world's biggest importers of wheat too. So it's from a food security issue, it's also important if in this summer, for example, if global wheat harvests were lower than normal, which is likely with El Nino this year, then Egypt might face increased price for its imported wheat as well.
Angus Blair talking Egypt with us on Counting the Cost. Thank you for that, Angus.
You're very welcome. Hopefully do this again.